catching up with my dad this weekend. He's a big Giants fan. Whenever I get time with him, I try always to pull another story from his years as a helicopter pilot. First in Vietnam flying Hueys, and then later in the Army Air National Guard. Spent a lot of time flying, and I never tire of hearing those stories. I love the inside story that only comes from someone who's lived it. And when you get that out, well, at least me, I often come away in awe of what folks have accomplished, and what he accomplished as an officer, as a pilot. Grateful for how much of his discipline and the courage that he's passed along to me. We were talking about flying, and I'd been sharing or reminiscing about some of my own experiences in a limited time flying a helicopter. Like the day I flew down over Gillette Stadium toward a small airport in Plymouth. The instructor handed me the controls, and I thought, okay, flying straight ahead, that's the tough part, because you're maneuvering, the all three major controls, the cyclic, the collective, and the pedals. And I was wrong. The hard part actually is hovering. And in working on that, within seconds, what should have been a steady hover over the airfield turned into something that looked more like the pirate ship ride at an amusement park. And it gave me a whole new respect for the skill it takes just to keep a helicopter still in midair. And talking with my dad and bringing up this, it led me to another story from earlier this year about the tragic accident I'd read about when a helicopter crashed over the Hudson River. And the details of that were pretty crazy. The main rotor of the helicopter separated from the rest of the aircraft. And investigators, I think it's the NTSB, haven't finished their report yet. But I've heard a number of experts say they believe it was an incident of what's called mast bumping. And to put it simply, mast bumping happens when the main rotor, teeters far enough during turbulence or pilot error that the hub actually strikes the mast. And it's relatively rare. But when it happens, it's catastrophic. In other words, fatalities. And there are no second chances when of course the main rotor comes off. And that's when my dad, during the conversation, sort of leaned back, so to speak, and said, fly what you want and log what you need. And he explained in the military, flight training isn't just about hours in the air. It's about all these different iterations of training, auto rotations at low levels, confined area training, hover downs, where you have to stop in midair and hover down into a confined area. The maneuvers that really matter. And when you fly, every hour gets logged. Not because anyone's necessarily padding the numbers, but because more logs drive maintenance. And military maintenance on aircraft is not like commercial aviation. Airlines, I was on a couple of flights this weekend out at a wedding in Idaho. Airlines balance safety with profit, right? It costs money to maintenance an aircraft. The military really has no such concern because safety and readiness are paramount. They're everything. So that means the military aircrafts are actually over-maintained. Parts are replaced early. Machines are grounded if there's ever a hint of doubt. The logs aren't just paperwork. They're sort of a lifeline. It's the discipline of going the extra mile, doing more than the minimum. Because when the stakes are high, the minimum is never enough. I think of another quick analogy. Obviously, mentioned the first week in football. That same principle shows up in football. Every coach worth their salt drills it into their players' heads. The concept of playing to the whistle. You don't stop when you think the play is over. You finish the block, you chase down the runner. That last ounce of effort is often the difference between a broken play and a game-changing moment. And that's what leadership looks like. Going all the way through, even when most people would stop, covering your bases, refusing to quit early. And this principle is most alive in our work with our clients. A recent example, we were with a longtime client family, people we've known since our Merrill Lynch days, um, um, a great portfolio, um, um, kids in college, the picture of stability. And on the surface, clients are confident, even relaxed. But when we walked through updating their goals planning statement, using a number based on what they're actually spending today as an assumption, as a projection, not the future smaller number that they'd assume they'd live on later. And here's the truth, people always understate what they'll spend in retirement. Not sometimes, not occasionally, but always. So when we put together what we consider the real numbers correlated with what they're spending today, projected out in the future, you could actually visibly see their shock, their focus broke. They shut down a bit in the conversation. The comfortable story they'd been telling themselves that they were in perfect shape, nothing to consider, um, had just been challenged. And this conversation came back to me, this meeting came back to me because it reminded me that this is the moment where many advisors flinch. They may soften the truth. They may move on quickly, or worse, they let their ego drive the conversation, talking more, explaining harder, trying to prove they're right. But that's not leadership. That's ego and insecurity. And what I've learned to do instead over the years in scenarios like this is instead to lean in, not with statements of fact, but with more questions. Maybe turn the talking off, to listen, to strip myself out of the equation and focus solely on them. Because my job isn't to win a debate. My job is to understand their fears, uncover what's not clarified, and guide them forward. And here's where the storm rolled in, the conversation about life insurance. After hearing sort of a surprise on what they needed in terms of being more disciplined about retirement savings, the thought of adding another cost, even a relatively small one for something like term insurance, felt like too much. It was easier to brush aside. The probability of dying early felt remote. The timing felt wrong. But this is exactly what leadership, where leadership is tested, because ignoring life insurance, for example, in those years would create a catastrophic failure in the financial plan if the primary breadwinner passed away. Just like mast bumping in the helicopter. Very rare, but when it happens, there are effectively no other second chances. Our job as advisors is to run toward the storm, that conversation, not away from it, not to protect our comfort, not to worry about whether the client likes us more or not in the moment, and certainly not to let our egos dictate the conversation. It's about professionalism, about putting their best interests above all else, about refusing to stop the play until the whistle blows, until the plan is not just discussed, but executed. You could feel perhaps the ego, I could whisper in my own mind, don't push them too hard. Ego says they'll figure it out later. Ego wants us to be liked more than respected. But leadership doesn't care about ego. Leadership says, if this were my family, what would I want someone to do for me? Leadership means willing to absorb the discomfort in order to protect the client. Leadership means asking the tough questions, holding the line when they'd rather look away, and ensuring the critical pieces of the plan actually get done. And that doesn't just apply to life insurance, obviously, it applies to other things that we're all familiar with in this conversation: estate planning, to saving discipline, to staying focused, investing through volatility. Every one of this requires us to fight through the natural resistance, theirs and ours, and take responsibility until the job's finished. This is why my dad's quote, "Fly what you want, log what you need," sticks with me. Flying is exhilarating, but logging is what actually saves lives. Playing football is exciting, but playing to the whistle is what wins games. Advising clients is rewarding, but following through with that advice is what builds futures. Leadership is never about doing the minimum. It's about doing what is necessary. It's about the discipline to go the extra mile, to cover every base, to make sure that what needs to be done actually gets done. And that's the difference between good enough and greatness, between the plans that crumble and the plans that endure, between being an advisor and being a leader. Everybody have a fantastic, fantastic week. Go be relentless. Thank you.